As Lorna mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about digital opportunity and climate change solutions. This is a sector I've been in since 2009 when I founded the what's now known as Acuvio, or now as Diligent ESG, which is a sustainability reporting platform for large enterprise. Today, we've got a kind of a very diverse group of attendees, so I'm going to keep the presentation a little bit of a mixed bag, so there's something in there for everyone. But I'm going to touch upon three key areas as digital and solutions, and the climate change and environmental piece will be the subject matter that we'll focus upon. During this, I'm also going to kind of give you a little bit of a sprinkling of my journey over the past 10 or 12 years, and hopefully that will give you some pause for thought, some assistance or some encouragement, or also give you some thought-provoking ideas in terms of how you can direct your organizations. When we talk about climate change, this is what it's all about. But and I think it's very easy to forget on a day-to-day basis that we're all sitting out here on this pale blue dot, and I think Warren Buffett put it nicely a few years ago when he said that from a financial perspective, he said if you were given a car at age 20, you'd look after it. You would, and you were if you were told that is the only car that you're going to have ever for the rest of your life, you would polish it regularly, you would service it regularly, you would look after it. He was talking about how you look after your body. You have one body and one mind, but equally we have one planet. So, a couple of years later, he used the same analogy and applied it to the planet when he was talking about climate change and ESG in general. The message is that climate change and ESG has a financial benefit, and there are several financial opportunities within the climate change sector. The environmental and climate change and ESG sector is probably the single greatest market opportunity since, I suppose, the advent of computers. It gives so much opportunity, so many different diverse views and perspectives that the possibilities are endless. And in my role at Diligent now, I was the founder and CEO at Acuvio, where we were innovating to help large organizations to quantify their impact on the environment, how they could improve things, but equally how to solve some of these problems and how to address them. And our task back then was to try and do this, globally. Thankfully, with now as part of Diligent, we have access through our boards platform to all of the leading board members around the world, in all of the world's largest organizations. So we have a greater sphere of influence. Sometimes people get a little bit lost in the thought of climate change, and they think, oh, there's nothing we can really do. They complain about the Green Party here and there, and they complain about emissions from the tailpipe, and then they start giving out about unrealistic expectation of farmers and things like that, in terms of reducing herd numbers, and this is the general discourse in Ireland. But I just want to cast your mind back to the 80s and 90s. Some of you, by the sounds of the attendee list, may not have been alive back then, but for those of us who were, the 80s and 90s, the media was predominantly dominated by talk of the ozone layer. And, the point that I'm taking from this is that as a global civilization, we took action and we had solutions in place, and we addressed that challenge, whereby the ozone layer was at an increasing layer was thinning, and so that was causing issues, obviously, for radiation seeping onto the population, particularly closer to the southern hemisphere. Now, the chart on screen is something that might be surprising to a lot of you because it's not in the media. Climate change dominates the media at the moment, but in 2020, 2021. We took a regressive step backwards in terms of, the maximum yearly extent of the ozone hole. And quite a lot of people are surprised about this, and they're not aware of it, and they're certainly not seeing it in the media. Now, the subtext of this is that these charts and graphs show the maximum yearly. So the ozone expands and contracts. But the main commentary around the 2021 expansion of the ozone was that the maximum piece was actually influenced heavily by colder and stronger than usual winds that extended it beyond the norm. But it's fair to say that if we hadn't taken action in the 80s and 90s and removed many of the ozone depleting substances and CFCs from our product lines and from our industrial operations, that this could have in 2021 created a catastrophic runaway problem. So we have, as a civilization, the opportunity and we have the capability of addressing these massive global issues. And I think it's important to point out as well that, when you're talking about the ozone hole, it's not a small thing. It's 24.8 million square kilometers, roughly the size of North America. So, for us to globally address challenges like CFCs and address that in the 80s and 90s, surely we can address climate change, in the 2020s and beyond. So today, I'm going to share my views on climate change solutions and invention. I'm going to give you some ideas there. By that, I mean, I'm going to highlight some areas where there are opportunities to improve. I'm going to look at insights and new perspectives into ESG. I'm conscious that many of today's attendees don't know much about ESG or sustainability. And ESG is, of course, environmental social governance. And so I'm going to give you an insight as to what's driving that. What are the things that are influencing it? Where are the opportunities within that market, and how can we take advantage of those opportunities? I'm going to share some insights into the market trends and emerging issues, not just here in Ireland, but globally and around the world in different geographies where different focuses exist. And throughout this, I'm going to give you a bit of a sprinkle of my journey founding a QVO through to acquisition in 2021. For those of you who have joined us from corporates today, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks as to how you influence your corporate to set out on its ESG journey, something that's very positive. And at the end, we'll have some Q&A. So if you want to use the Q&A function throughout the session, just pop those questions into the chat box and I'll address them at the end, and we can take it from there. So a little bit about myself, I suppose. I was one of those kids in school that, yes, I was environmentally conscious, and yes, I was leading my national school to, collect the recycling Coke cans and stuff like that. But there was a financial motive. So I'm one of those people that always sees a business opportunity from an environmental one. So I quickly put together that, by collecting all of the Coke cans from the lunches each day, we could actually, through a Tesco program, we could actually get a computer into our small school in the west coast of Ireland. So that was something that led to a couple of IBM computers landing into the school back in 1993. And that was quite exciting. So I was that geek. I was also heavily involved in hurling and football. So I was that kind of unusual geek. But I used to stare at this atlas on a daily basis. And I used to wonder. And one day, I think I was about 10 or so, one day I was looking at this and I just was amazed at how big Greenland was. And that, Greenland is just so enormous. And I just wondered at this. It's 2 or 3 times the size of Australia. It's bigger than Africa. And just this just really overwhelmed me. And I mentioned this to one of the teachers, and the teacher at the time just basically said, no, it's wrong. What you see is completely misleading. It's wrong. It's actually smaller than the size of India. And I just couldn't believe that a new perspective, something I'm seeing like this is not true. So I did a bit of investigation and yes, I was that geek, and I found out that, yes, Greenland isn't even in the top 10 in terms of size. And yes, India is actually larger than Greenland. So this was a mind-blowing moment. And from that point on, I didn't believe anything I saw. I was a complete skeptic. I challenged everything I looked at. And it forced me as well that, with the advent of the internet, that I no longer focused on the news and the media in Ireland. I actually went the BBC. I went beyond that, and that opened my mind to new perspectives and new ideas. I think, interestingly, later on that same year, there was an encyclopedia salesman who called to the door of my parents' house. And, at the time, this was a thing where people would call door to door and try and sell you a set of encyclopedias. Some of you may have seen this on Friends, where Joey buys just one book, letter V. This was a very similar type of encounter. However, my personal journey into sales started on this day because I managed to convince my parents that it was more cost effective to buy a computer for at home than to buy a full set of encyclopedias. And so I did that rather than buying the encyclopedias, and I learned Encarta 95. And from that, I discovered an atlas that more correctly reflects the geographical land masses of the countries of the world. So I initially thought that this image was a scaling issue until I read about it. It's called the Gall-Peters projection, and it's a more accurate representation of the size of the land masses on the planet than the traditional atlas that we're all used to. You'll notice that Greenland is more correctly proportioned than in the previous. Now, it's not perfect either, and there are several others, but this challenged me at the core and challenged the way I looked at things, and I was never the same again. And I think, the conclusion I would have from that is that a change in new perspectives can lead to opportunity. So the message from today is climate change and climate change solutions are so new. They are absolutely so new. There are so many nuances and opportunities that it's just mind-blowing. I just can't get around to all of them myself. Open your eyes to different perspectives, consider different use cases, consider different modes of operation, countries of operation, and those climate change and ESG and environmental solutions will pop out at you. And I think just getting those new perspectives and challenging the status quo is the most important part. So coming back to the digital opportunity on solutions and talking a little bit about it in a bit more detail, like, what is ESG? So ESG is this phrase that has been bandied about since about 2017, 2018. And ESG was a phrase that wasn't really used up until then. It was typically known as corporate social responsibility, CSR. But back in 2017, there was a thing called the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, where all of the world's largest institutional investors signed up to a commitment to get their portfolio companies to report more and disclose more on their impact on climate change, as well as social and economic indicators. So they termed this phrase ESG. So it has been around for decades, but just it's been more prominent in the last 4 or 5 years. And the definition of ESG is environmental social governance are 3 central risk factors in measuring sustainability and societal impact of an organization, business, or investment. And I'm going to explore that in a bit more detail in a few minutes to see, how do we break this down into opportunities, into areas of exploration. So when you look at the ES and the G separately, E, we're all familiar with climate change, but within that, there's a significant biodiversity element, water efficiency, energy efficiency, carbon intensity, environmental management systems. So when we talk about climate change solutions, people immediately jump into, or when we even talk about ESG solutions, people jump into climate change. And that is an important one for sure, because it is one of the only time delimited elements within this, but it's no more important than human rights, child labor, and modern slavery. These are all very important points, but unfortunately with climate change, we have a very limited period of time to address it, whereas with some of the other areas, arguably, it gets worse if climate change gets worse. So there's a broad spectrum of areas here, and I'm just giving you a sprinkling of them, really. Within social, you've got equal opportunities, freedom of association, health and safety. Health and safety has been done pretty well in terms of digital solutions over the last number of years. Human rights, customer and products responsibility, and of course, child labor and modern slavery. And, the last couple of items there are probably where there's greatest opportunity, because they are areas that have been completely neglected in terms of digital solutions in the last 10 or 15 years. Solutions about raising awareness, solutions around whistleblowing. There are solutions out there today where an employee within a company can do a whistleblowing exercise on on the anti-bribery and corruption piece. But if they discover something on child labor and modern day slavery, that's very difficult to do. And perhaps our corporate structures probably don't help. There's a lot of opportunity there if you break it down and examine some of the challenges in each of the areas. Sometimes when people ask me, what do you do? And I tell them I'm in sustainability, they immediately think of Greta Thunberg and, the environmental activists. And, some people have accused me in the past of being a tree hugger and that kind of a thing. And I take that with a pinch of salt, because I'm one of those people that sees there's no reason, like being a tree hugger and running a successful business do not need to be mutually exclusive. I believe that if you can get a strong enough business that makes financial sense for organizations, that you can run a successful business and do good. So ESG ties into, when people ask me what is ESG, the quickest answer I give them is ESG equals integrity. It means doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And it's as simple as that. So what do I mean by that? Well, ESG over the past, like if we go back to 2009 when I started Acuvio, most of the conversation that I was having with prospective clients or individuals who helped me to develop the product and to come up with the design for the product, most of those individuals were in environmental roles. As time progressed, in 2012, it became sustainability. Some sustainability roles started coming into companies, and this was good. In 2014, 2015, it started to move more into the operational side of things, into energy efficiency. In 2016, 2017, and in particular in 2018, there was an explosion of interest from CFOs and investor relations directors across the board. In 2018, 2019, we sold into more investor relations directors than we did environmental or sustainability directors, by a factor of 3. So there was a flip, a very obvious in the terms of where the pain points are being felt, and the pain points are being felt most at the investor relations level, because they're investors who had signed that UN PRI charter that I mentioned earlier, and they were looking for non-financial metrics, and they wanted those non-financial metrics published alongside the financial metrics. And so if you're publishing a number around your greenhouse gas emissions as an organization in one hand, and to the left sheet, if your balance sheet is accurate and your GHG emissions inventory on the right hand side is inaccurate for some reason, well, that will undermine the accuracy of the balance sheet one. And so this is something that the investor community pretty quickly picked up on. And I'll touch upon that in a few more minutes. But suffice to say that ESG became a risk indicator. It became a risk indicator very quickly, and it became an indicator of an organization's ability to change and the organization's resilience. And to a certain extent, it also was a strong indicator of the quality of the people at management within organizations. And that was something as well that took me a bit by surprise, but I saw it increasingly over the years. All of within these comments are opportunities for solutions. Think about, how do you enable, an improved management capability in ESG? Think about how, these risk indicators can be incorporated into solutions. And that's one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons why, the acquisition of Acuvio by Diligent made sense, because Diligent is aggressively going into a GRC, or governance, risk and compliance area, and Acuvio is very strongly rooted in the ESG area, and combined we can tackle these risks. So why are people doing ESG? And so there's 4 or 5 areas here. Legislation is the obvious one, but I'm going to skip that because that kind of doesn't need any explanation really. But the other areas are the ones that are a bit more future looking. these are the ones that indicate and can dictate the future of legislation, but also the future of the non-tangible benefits. And this is where most of the opportunities lie. So the 5 key areas of ESG reporting are investment, legislation, opportunities and international competitiveness, public sentiment, brand equity, and employees. And employees is the one that's catching everybody's eyes in 2022. So risk mitigation. So I've talked about this a little bit earlier. And in terms of digital solutions, this is perhaps the area that digital solutions have the greatest opportunity to address them. And this is not just within the corporate environment. This is also now moving into the SME market. And I'll touch upon that a bit later again. There are some items listed here on the right. I'm not going to go through them all, but one of the things I want to highlight is that the investment community, who, institutional investors in particular, are pumping money into organizations that have ESG because they are perceived as a better run, more resilient organization that has anticipated upcoming legislation. The surprising thing for many companies is that it can take, so if legislation is introduced, like it has been introduced in Australia, New Zealand, and UK, and in certain areas, or across Europe in some cases, it can take large years or more to get their systems up to speed to actually address those legislationary issues. So they end up paying massive fines in the first couple of years, and they end up in the media for all the wrong reasons. They can end up on a defaulters list, for example. And in most of these countries, like in the UK, if you're not reporting, if you're not disclosing in line with an appropriate standard or protocol, it's treated the same as not reporting your tax affairs or not reporting your revenue figures in line with a particular accounting standard. It's treated exactly the same. So there's the same fines and the same black spot on your reputation. So some of this is starting to of companies. So they're now starting area. They're looking at what are the voluntary reporting trends, implementing systems around that in anticipation of legislation coming. But aside from that, there's other opportunities. One of the things we see here in Ireland in particular is Irish companies are viewed very positively internationally, and I'm very proud of that. And it's great. I've traveled extensively, and you go to the US, you go to the UK, you go to Central Europe, you go to Australia, whatever. Irish companies, particularly tech companies, are viewed and are held in very high regard. We're viewed also as being very green. That might be something to do with the color associated with the country, but we're viewed as being very environmentally friendly. The imagery of green fields and stone walls and this kind of thing, the more traditional look. But we're losing in international competitiveness in the last 2 to 3 years. Irish companies are losing internationally because although we're perceived as being green, when we're competing on RFP basis against other companies who have their, let's say, their GHG emissions or their ESG reporting done extensively, most Irish companies actually don't, and they'd have a pretty bad ESG reporting regime in place. And so, even though we have a very green image, the numbers don't back that up. And so that wasn't really a problem over the past 5 or 10 years because the weighting given to the ESG and sustainability metrics weren't particularly compelling. But in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, the weighting allocated to the disclosure of, let's say, your scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions, or your ESG reporting, or participating in a CDP, or any of these kind of terminologies, the weighting allocated to those has grown exponentially. And so now, internationally, many Irish companies are actually at a disadvantage. And there's an interesting dynamic as well. So Irish companies selling into the United States are still okay because companies in the United States are actually further behind. But Irish companies selling into the UK and into Central Europe are at a disadvantage because in the UK and in Central Europe, they're actually ahead of the Irish companies in that regard. So there's an opportunity there for us to be more internationally competitive. The other thing as well is a thing called the green premium. This is a trend that's come out in the last, I would say, 12, 18 months. There's a really cool video done by Bill Gates called The Green Premium. It's about a 10 or 12-minute video, but it's well worth the watch on YouTube. And just have a look at it. And it talks about, the trend where people and individuals, as well as companies, are now proving that they are willing to spend more to buy a product that comes from a more wholesome background. So they are willing to, invest in that, knowing socially that they're not contributing to a socially negative situation. And the classic example is fast fashion, right? So, Pennies is particularly popular in Ireland, and in fairness to them, they've done great work in improving the situation. And they've done great work in bringing out more sustainable products and working on their childhood or their supply chain to make sure that they root out childhood slavery and all of that kind of stuff. And they're very involved and very engaged. But fast fashion, this throwaway thing is contributing to waste very significantly. So people are now realizing that it's actually more efficient for them to spend more on a less number of items that are maybe perhaps higher quality, and to get a longer period of time out of them. And it's less on the financial decision-making process, but more so on the waste avoidance perspective. So there's a few opportunities within the fashion sector, which is interesting. People are moving with their feet, and equally within cosmetics as well. There's a massive trend within cosmetics as well towards more ethically produced products. So that leads us on then to public sentiment and brand equity. And quantifying this is an area that's very, very interesting as well. There are social media platforms out there that today can give you a score for your company based on keywords and phrases that are out there in the media that are being said about you, around your customer service, around your brand, around your values, around what kind of an image you're portraying in the market. And this again can be used and can be applied to the ESG work. So there's a lot of opportunity there in digital solutions in particular that can take advantage of this trend and that can monetize it very, very quickly and swiftly. And this applies not just to the large corporates, but also to smaller companies. And again, tying back into the previous point, can actually give a competitive advantage very, very quickly and very cost effectively. This area here, employees, is the single biggest conversation I'm having this year around ESG. There is for any of you who have been involved in hiring, it is very difficult to hire people in 2022. And there is across North America in particular, and there is a thing that many organizations refer to as the Great Resignation. And what people are seeing is that it's actually easier to attract and to retain staff by improving your ESG credentials and adding that level of integrity into your internal and external messaging, and not to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. So it's one thing program and then talking about that to your employee, but then sending them a pack or a welcome pack, which is filled with products that are throwaway items, wasteful, and have been shipped from faraway places in the world. That just sets the wrong example, and that's the type of thing that is actually pushing people away from organizations very, very quickly. So it's having a wholesome approach to integrity and ESG that's actually helping to be a strong motivator in recruitment and retention across companies. And we've seen that employees want to be part of that solution. People in general want to be part of a company that is working proactively and positively towards addressing some of the more the larger challenges of today, like climate change, like ESG. They don't want to be part of a company that's just creating widgets for, at the cheapest price in the cheapest location and shipping that around the world, and just being completely and utterly focused on quarter results. They are increasingly more aware in working for companies that are part of the solution, and ESG is that indicator. So there's a lot there. I hope I've given you some insights there into what's going on. Again, some additional trends that I just put together this morning. These are some of the items that come up regularly where there are gaps in the market. So any of you innovators out there who are looking for the next idea, here's some gold nuggets. Supply chain engagement and verification. So for example, organizations today are, starting to look at their supply chains. They're starting to ask them questions about what are they doing in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions reporting, but they're not verifying it. Some smart technology around how we verify it. People engagement, how do we broaden that? How do we increase the reach of engagement? Perhaps gamify engagement around some of the more topical ESG items. Greenwashing verification. So what do I mean by greenwashing? So greenwashing is a phrase that means that you're claiming to be green or you're claiming to be environmentally conscious, but you're not actually. It's just merely a front. And there are several examples of organizations around the world who have been caught out on this. But again, today, even in Ireland or in the UK or many countries around the world, if you walk into your local store, your local supermarket, and you pick up a product, it's probably got recyclable packaging written on the box or on the label or on the packaging. Unfortunately, half of the time, this is incorrect. They're not actually recyclable, but merely the graphic design agency that designed the logo or that designed the packaging has put this logo on it. And maybe they put it on correctly on a previous version of the packaging, but the design hasn't been changed to reflect the change in the plastic or the change in material. And this leads to the next point, which is an expertise deficit, because unfortunately, many of the advertising regulatory bodies around the world, they are struggling to police this kind of greenwashing because they don't have the expertise. They lack the support and the knowledge to determine the difference between the different types of plastics that are produced and used in packaging. And so companies are continuing to label and brand themselves as one thing when in fact they're something else. And so this is greenwashing. This is greenwashing verification. It's not very well known. It's known within certain nuanced sectors. But it's an area that I think will get greater public attention and greater media coverage over the next 4 or 5 years in particular. So there's some solutions required there. Benchmarking of companies. Everyone from Google down has been trying to benchmark companies on ESG metrics. I myself have submitted some ideas to Google 3 or 4 years ago, and they're working their way through their search algorithm. Whether or not they will ever get published, who knows? But there is an insatiable appetite at the moment for benchmarking, because companies, no matter what sector they're in, they want to know how are they doing relative to their peers, relative to their competitors. And there are some nuanced problems in there, such as data privacy, data confidentiality. But the tide is changing, because something that happened just last year in the United States in particular is that some of the SEC filings now require some disclosure on Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions around greenhouse gas emissions. And so that gives you a very public number that can be used to benchmark companies against each other, that is strictly sticking to an accepted standard. And that, I think, is becoming effective from 2023, 2024, depending on the year end. So there's lots of opportunity there for benchmarking, and that's certainly an area of my focus over the next few years. There are a myriad of disjointed market initiatives as well. So sometimes within the ESG space, it's known as a kind of acronym soup, in that you've got all of these reporting initiatives like CDP and GRI and SASB and all of this stuff. And there are just so many different standards, protocols, reporting initiatives that it can be mind-blowing, really, for an organization that sets out to report their sustainability goals. They just really don't know where to start. So simplifying that, again, is another area. I've mentioned product labeling and extracting valuable insights from data. So this ESG sector is going through a transitionary period, much like the financial sector did, 20, 30 years ago, when they had all of this data, but they lacked the power or ability to interpret that data in a usable manner to influence change. And yes, there are solutions out there that will visualize and graphically and represent all of this, but interpreting it into actionable data that connects back to solutions. All of this is something that's in desperate need. And the one final point, which I haven't listed here, is you'll often hear organizations setting targets like net zero targets or science-based targets, these types of things. And casting the eye 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line, when organizations have reduced as much of their emissions and has improved their overall climate change performance as much as they possibly can, there will come a point where they can no longer reduce any further, or the cost benefit of reducing just isn't there. So they're going to look to mitigation strategies, or what's sometimes called carbon sequestration. In the past, carbon credits is a mechanism, a financial instrument that has been used to offset some of these impacts. So when we talk about innovation and solutions and digital solutions, it doesn't have to be a piece of software. Digital solutions can be financial instruments that leverage finance to create and to finance ethical and sustainability related projects. And so, there's a huge, vast array of opportunity in that area to support both technology solutions and other solutions as well. So, as I said at the start, the range and scope of opportunity, digital opportunity in particular, within climate change and sustainability and environment is just unparalleled at the moment. As I said at the outset, we have a bit of a mixed bag of attendees today, and quite often the most common question I get asked is, I work in a company that isn't really doing anything in ESG, what should I do? And, the first thing is, how do you get started? So it's a little bit like, eating an elephant, that old proverb, take it one bite at a time, be realistic in setting out your aspirations or your goals. Perhaps the easiest thing to do to get started is to decide what are you going to report upon. And the easiest thing to do in many instances is to look at your competitors, figure out what are your competitors doing, and maybe, aspire to catch up to them and maybe overtake them. I would always suggest to companies to start off with a very realistic 1, 3, 5, and 10-year plan around, how they're going to start reporting and improving upon their data. Quite often, companies come to me and they're starting late, and their kind of hair is on fire, and they're like, "Oh my God, we've been asked by our investors to produce these numbers over the next, within 6 months. Give us a system that will do this for us." And the answer is that it's not always that easy. It can take, a couple of years, and it's nothing to do with any implementations or anything like that. It's just got to do with most companies don't have the right data being collected in the right systems. Now, thankfully, we've been developing solutions for that, but starting late is not something that can be addressed in a 3 or 6 month period. So it's important to set that expectation at a boardroom level before the CEO goes out and makes a commitment to be net zero in 12 months. I have seen that 100 times, where an overzealous CEO goes in front of the board and says, they're asked the question, what are you going to do about your climate change performance? And he or she responds with, we're going to be net neutral, or we're going to be net zero within 3 years. And they have no idea of even where they're starting from. And so typically I get a phone call the following Monday saying, "Hey, our CEO has has committed to getting to net zero in 2 or 3 years. We need your software." And I'm like, okay, well, do you know where you're starting from? And that's often the challenge. So that leads to a lot of teams being overwhelmed. It leads to key person risk, and it often leads to burnout as well. So, throughout today's presentation, I think I've shared with you some snippets of my journey in climate change solutions. I hope that you've been getting a sense of my approach and thought processes and around climate change solutions. I hope that I've given you some inspiration about some of the market trends that exist. But just to cast the mind back again, just to look at my particular journey, we started out in 2009, and in 2009, the idea of having greenhouse gas emissions reporting software or sustainability or ESG reporting software was absolutely daft. I frequently went to visit environmental engineers, environmental officers, environmental and sustainability experts in various companies around Ireland, the United States, and in the UK in the early days. And they often would turn around and say, hey, do you want a job? Like, you can give up the startup. They just didn't understand the way this was going to go. And in the early days, we were named Managed CO2, but it grew so quickly that we actually rebranded to Acuvio to reflect the broader range of activities that was now being covered by such a software solution. Our mission back in 2009 was to enable large organizations to more effectively tackle climate change through easy-to-use software. That hasn't changed. In 13 years, it hasn't changed. And it remains our backbone to success. Some quick fire facts on the Acuvio journey. These are some of the most commonly asked questions I get. We're founded in 2009. Our first customer was in 2011. That meant for 2 full years, we shoved pizza under the door to myself and my co-founder Roy while we developed the software. We got our first version out the door in 2011, and we delivered that. I remember distinctly driving to that presentation, and we were still writing code in the car. Thankfully, I was driving, he was coding. We're not that crazy. 3 original founders: myself, Roy Meany, and Derek Spillane. We did a fundraise of 600,000 through Enterprise Ireland, through 2 other VC groups in 2012. We didn't go as well as we had anticipated. We didn't follow on with the Series A. The market just didn't respond. We targeted the UK market, and we encountered what was called at the time a double dip recession in the UK. Fundraising back in 2009 was really, really difficult. And that's why we didn't actually, we spent 3 years trying to raise funds, and we didn't actually successfully get an investor until 2012. So the market then was starting to pick up. Quite a lot of talk in the United States. There was new legislation in the UK, but the fear meant that people weren't buying discretionary items, and this software was deemed discretionary at the time. Brexit actually was fantastic. I remember I did a currency hedge because we were exclusively selling into the UK at the time. 95% of our revenues were sterling GBP. So I remember doing a hedge on sterling. So I bought a forward contract for sterling just before the Brexit vote. And I think I got, for every euro, the contract, or for every pound, the hedge was worth €1.47. So when Brexit happened and that went down to 107, that was actually a significant shot in the arm as a bolster to the company back then. So it was great. And that pushed us on. It gave us an extra cushion. So we said, right, with Brexit, it's uncertain. Let's try and sell into North America remotely without sending anybody off in planes. Now, the general consensus and the general view of all of the advice we were getting was that that's not going to be successful. But very, very quickly, we picked up some big name clients in a very short period of time. And the rest, as they say, is history. If Brexit didn't happen, we probably wouldn't have focused on North America as quickly as we did. And the slow growth that we saw from 2009 to 2016 probably would have remained. But thankfully, because of that, we actually saw rapid growth in 2017 and 2018, leading to exponential growth in 2018 and 21 due to the continued focus on the product. And I would say that we were in the right place at the right time, because when the market didn't respond, there were our competitors, it didn't respond for them either. So our competitors actually changed and diversified into various different things. So they lost focus on their product, whereas we remained focused on the product. And by the time 2019, 2020 came, we were accelerating beyond exponential. So in 2021, then we were considering a multi-million euro Series A investment. But when Diligence and ourselves started talking, I realized that, getting, if you go back to our original mission, our mission is to make as many companies in the world, to tool them up, to give them the solutions that help them to be more aggressive and to be able to tackle their impact on climate change and on ESG in general. The Diligent acquisition made 100% sense because it gives us instant access to boardrooms around the world. And that proved too attractive. So what are we doing now in 2021, 2022? We're leveraging the Diligence other product sets to combine that with the Accuvio product set. And some would use the phrase disrupt. I hate that phrase. I think that's just a phrase that's bandied about as trendy in Silicon Valley. But what we're doing is more aligned to we're creating a new category of solution, which we're calling ESG RC, which is a mouthful again. We'll probably come up with a better name, but it's environmental, social, governance, risk, and compliance. It's combining all of that stuff into one as an emerging category. So a little bit about Diligent. I never heard of Diligent prior to 2020. Never knew who they were. However, since then, when I've mentioned to people, when the acquisition happened, and I mentioned that to some of our clients, they immediately responded by saying, "Oh yeah, we're a Diligent customer as well. We use them for their board solution or their governance, risk, and compliance solution." So I was pleasantly surprised. They have access to over 25,000 clients as well, which gives us a phenomenal access across the globe for our product. And so we today deliver ESG reporting software around the world. We still do that. It is our main selling points are that it's easy to use software. We have remained focused on that unique value proposition from the very beginning. It addresses all the global standards and protocols and helps organizations to quantify and report their impact on ESG, mainly on climate change, but also on S and the G, the social and governance elements. And as such, it helps them to improve and enhance. And with Diligent, now we're bringing this to the boardrooms around the world. One of the cool things as well at Diligent, I am pleased that I was involved in the early days, is this climate leadership certification. So when I talked about earlier on about my personal mission being to, try and influence organizations around the world by giving them tools to tackle climate change, I'm proud to be involved in Diligent's leadership certification that's actually educating board members now around the world. And they have some really good courses. I've contributed to some of the material in them. I've taken some of these courses as well, and it's quite interesting. So I'd encourage anybody who's delving into that and have a look at it and consider it. So with that, I'll hand back over to Lorna and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So great presentation, really insightful. And for me as well, I learned a lot there as well. Interesting to hear your thoughts on the climate change solution invention, your perspective on ESG and the different trends and issues you're seeing. For example, that the investor community are really driving the needs for those metrics and looking for a way to report on them. And also the emerging challenges such as the supply chain engagement and verification that you're seeing. So appreciate you sharing that. And I think as well the tips for all the people on the calls who are maybe starting to look towards their ESG journey was also really helpful. All right, so let's question. So I do have one here, Adrian, and I'll just read it out. So it's, can I ask what your thoughts on carbon credits? And then there's a comment, not just a way to allow polluters to keep polluting, to do so.
Yeah, so it's a really topical question, right? So just to get back, I suppose, you look at the carbon credit mechanism, it is a financial instrument. Its original intention is, to fund projects that otherwise wouldn't get funded or wouldn't make sense. So a lesser known project is one that's very common in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's associated with carbon offsets around what's called VERs. So sorry, there's a few different types of carbon credits, right? Back in the early days of carbon credits, there was a thing called CERs, which are certified emission reductions, and then you had VERs, which are verified emission reductions. This is a very complicated answer, but I'm going to try and simplify it a bit. So CERs are certified emission reductions, which are typically built in third world countries or developing countries. They're typically things like hydroelectric plants or wind farms, and you own a portion of it, kind of, right? So a CER then is certified by an independent third party such as SGS or Bureau Veritas, and they make sure that this offset is sold once and once only. Interestingly, from a solutions perspective, one of the challenges they had in the early days was proving that you were the only person who owned that credit. There's probably an opportunity there for blockchain to jump in there and actually try and, you know, provide a kind of a unique token so that you are the undisputed owner of a particular CER or offset. Then you've got VERs, which are more voluntary emission reductions. And again, these are more associated with more of the social projects, a little bit less tangible. And typically the CERs are more valuable than the VERs, but it was easier to raise money for big infrastructure projects with CERs than it was VERs. Now, to answer your point, is this a way for people to just continue polluting? It is, yes. There's no question about that. Historically, that is how people have treated these. They have said that rather than going to the expense of reducing our emissions, that we should just buy a load of credits and make ourselves carbon neutral. Now, that's when the whole net zero terminology. So what I would do is, what I would recommend in the interest of time is that you look up at the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, and look at the difference there. So net zero is in the media at the moment because that's more about reducing your active emissions as much as you possibly can by attacking all of the various avenues that you can. And then whatever the remainder is, then you look for ways and mechanisms to, dare I say, offset, but you don't necessarily need to purchase offsets. You can look into other carbon sequestration solutions as well. It is an evolving area. It is an area that for some people is as head scratching as Bitcoin. So, you know, it's very difficult to answer that categorically on today. It's more of a topic that we could have a separate hour to discuss and argue. And, you know, maybe that's a topic for another day.
Sure. Thanks, Adrian, for giving us your thoughts on that. It is a complicated one to answer. Okay, so we have another question here. Where did the idea come back in 2009?
Yeah, and actually, one of the attendees has just WhatsApped me, and good to see you. The same question he's just sent me there. So yeah, in 2009, so the first, I worked in so after leaving university, I went to work in Accenture. And at Accenture, I got involved in a project in Zambia, where I went to work in a hospital for about 6 or 7 weeks. And when my employer found out about that, they wanted to, and they knew what I was going down there to do, I was raising money to help build a wing onto a hospital down there. Now, all of the money that was raised was going to the building of the hospital. I was paying my own way. I just want to clarify that. But Accenture very generously turned around and said, well, hey, here's, I think it was 10 or 15,000 euro that they gave towards this. And I think straight out of university, I was in Accenture for maybe 2 or 3 months, and this kind of jumped out at me as, you know, really, really good. This was done through their CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility Committee. And, you know, I held Accenture in greater esteem after that experience. I went down there, delivered it, reported back. That was my first encounter with ESG and sustainability. Later, or a few years later, I was in Dell, and Dell very publicly were picked up in the Wall Street Journal as incorrectly reporting their greenhouse gas emissions in 2008. And as a result, I had share option or stock options like most employees. I had stock options in Dell, and I came in one morning and everybody was standing around the computers kind of saying, hey, our stock options went down by 15% last night. I was like, why? And the reason was that the Wall Street Journal picked up this carbon neutral claim, slammed it. It was based on no standard or no protocol that was accepted at the time. And that was the first time I realized that ESG and sustainability and carbon can actually impact financial elements and value at that level. So at that point, I said, surely Dell must be using a solution for this. And that was when I discovered that there are no solutions out there for this. And that was the light bulb moment. There were some solutions out there, but they were done on a site-specific basis. So if you had a plant, or if you had an office here, you needed a single server running it there. This was in or around the same time as AWS was coming on stream. So SaaS and software as a service was becoming more prevalent, more popular. And so I saw an opportunity. And that was effectively the nugget of the idea. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Another question here about the acquisition of Diligence. So the question is, what can you do for climate change as part of Diligence that you couldn't have done independent?
Yes, so this is an interesting one. So Diligent have a few other products that I see as strategically valuable to IQVIO's mission. So one is the boards solution. So I mentioned that earlier on. They have, boards. The boards product is used by most of the boardrooms around the world. And so we had the opportunity to piggyback on that to get the IQVIO product and solution set into those hands, into those decision makers' hands. The other thing as well is there are other products such as Manzama, CGlytics, Insightia that actually are data harvesting tools, but they interpret the data in the way that we can use it for ESG benchmarking and scoring. And just looking at the way the market is going, I wouldn't have had access to those types of companies had we remained independent. I wouldn't have had access to those kinds of people had we remained independent. So, it was an obvious one. It made absolute sense. We initially tried to do a partnership, but that just wasn't going to work. So the acquisition was the next step. So that made a lot of sense. And actually, it's proving to be very, very successful. And it's expanded our sphere of influence significantly in just 6 months.
Okay, thank you for that. And there's one more here. Is there a certification like ISO that companies can sign up to? Now, as far as I know, we have the Diligent Climate Leadership Program that we just announced. So that's one that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if you have any others.
Yeah, so there's a couple of 1 or 2 day courses you can do in GHG reporting, for example, ISO 14064-1, Carbon Action, a Cork-based company, CMSE, they also do it. Good course, 2 days gives you great foundation in it. There are a myriad of other courses that you can do in and around GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, around the broader disclosure of ESG topics. Most of those are online courses. Some are administered in physically as well. But a company can also, there is a 14,001 certification, which does incorporate some elements of climate change and GHG reporting. But I think the best thing to do there would be to look at things like the CDP initiative, look at DJSI, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, or now known as S&P Global, was once known as RobecoSAM as well. These things change their names quite a bit. And if you're not publicly listed, that doesn't make a difference. You can still respond into these kind of programs. And I would recommend the CDP one actually as a starting point.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Adrian. We are going to have to wrap up now. So thank you, Adrian, for everything that you've shared today. It's been really interesting. And I think we've all learned more about digital opportunity in ESG solutions. And for those who have joined, just remember we still have sessions left today. And if you haven't signed up yet, I can just paste the link in the chat, but they're available on atlantec.ie. So appreciate everyone joining for this year's AtlanTec Fest. And I hope that we next year and maybe even in person, all going well. All right. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.